In Soviet Russia, music plays you. Hello YouTube, how you doing? So maybe that wasn't my best joke, but it was relevant, I promise. Today we are going to talk about Dmitri Shostakovich's struggle to survive during Joseph Stalin's rule over Soviet Russia. When Stalin really came to power in 1924, Dmitri Shostakovich was a 17-year-old conservatory student. He kind of flew under the radar at this point, but he already did have a reputation as being a child prodigy. He actually wrote his first major composition 2 years later at the age of 19 in the form of his first symphony, which was written as his graduation piece. However, he was close to not graduating at all because he failed his first attempt at his exam on Marxist theology. But he was able to take it later and pass, luckily. His reputation for being lackluster at best towards Soviet politics didn't catch up to him till a little bit later though. His first symphony actually attained a quite high level of international success. It was premiered in Berlin by Bruno Walter, a very famous conductor, pianist, and composer. It was then performed in Philadelphia under Leopold Stokowski, and he actually also provided the first recording of the piece. Young Shosti wrote 2 more symphonies during the next year, but they weren't quite as well received because of their experimental nature. In 1927, Dmitri was introduced to the music of Gustav Mahler. Mahler was basically one of the leaders of post-romanticism, and he came from the Austrian Empire. I can see why he was so intrigued by Mahler's musical style because I also happen to be quite obsessed with Mahler's music. There's just something about his symphonies that tend to encompass all of human emotion and the human experience. But that's off topic a bit. Suffice to say, Shostakovich's style began to pick up a little bit of Western influence. For the next 7 years, Shosti worked to compose an opera called Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District. Yeah, Mtsensk. There's a link in the description that teaches you how to pronounce it. He was extremely proud of this opera, and it opened with great success. Original reviews called it an opera that could only have been written by a Soviet composer brought up with the best tradition of Soviet values. Everything seemed to be going pretty well for young Shostakovich until 2 years later, when Stalin decided to attend a performance of Lady Macbeth. Shostakovich himself was present at this performance, which meant that he got to see firsthand Stalin's evident disappointment in the piece. Every time the brass played loudly, he could see Stalin stifle a shiver, and then during one of the sex scenes that's a really important and serious moment in the piece, Stalin and his friends were laughing and joking about the sexual nature. Soon after, a very scathing article appeared in a very prominent Soviet Union newspaper called Pravda. In this article, Shostakovich and his opera were heavily denounced. Suddenly, his opera went from being a shining example of Soviet art to a coarse, primitive, vulgar, formalist piece of crap. He began to lose money, and approximately 3/4 of his income fell off. Even newspapers that had previously written very positive reviews of his music began to print retractions and make apologies for their obvious inability to see the horrible nature of his works. This year, 1936, happened to be the beginning of the Great Terror, a time during which a lot of artists, philosophers, scientists, and academics began to be politically targeted, arrested, and even executed at the hands of the Soviet government. Some of those killed during this Great Terror were Shostakovich's close friends, family, and even one of his patrons. By the time the Great Terror was really in full swing, Shostakovich was already mostly done with his 4th Symphony, a work heavily influenced by Mahler. He knew it was a dangerous piece to compose at this time, especially with the anti-Western leanings that the Soviet government was portraying. But because it was almost done, he decided to complete it and start rehearsals for its premiere. However, he mysteriously withdrew the piece after a few rehearsals. There have been several of his close friends and family that have come forward to say that there was an official ban that convinced Shostakovich to voluntarily withdraw the piece. The work wasn't actually premiered until 1961. In response to this censorship, Shostakovich maintained a lower profile and pretty much only wrote incidental music for movie soundtracks. This continued until he wrote the 5th Symphony, which gained him much greater political favor due to its conservative leanings and lack of Western influence. Throughout the Second World War, Shosti composed some symphonies, chamber music, and even some solo pieces. However, he began to fall from favor again with the composition of his Ninth Symphony in 1945. Stalin had wanted him to compose this great victorious piece to celebrate the end of the war, but instead Shostakovich composed this very pretty piece, and it was very Haydn influenced. Stalin was furious, and this in part led to the Zhdanov decree in 1948. This decree wanted to remove all traces of Western music from Russian music and led to the banning of a lot of Shostakovich's music. Shostakovich was so reviled by the Soviet government that every night he would wait by the elevator with his bags packed so that when people came to arrest him and take him away, he at least wouldn't be disturbing his family. He became a poor, broken man and was forced to bend to the will of his government. He was never free to speak his mind, and he was even forced to compose a cantata called The Song of the Forest that praised Stalin as being the great gardener. Shostakovich was only able to regain some of his compositional freedom upon Stalin's death in 1953. He celebrated this with the composition of his 10th Symphony, which to this day remains one of his most famous and often performed pieces. This period following Stalin's death finally led to the publication of a lot of pieces that Shostakovich had secretly written and had hidden in his desk. Not all went well for Shostakovich after Stalin's death because he was still at the mercy of a very, very powerful Soviet government. It was even suggested by Dmitri's son that the only reason Shostakovich eventually joined the Communist Party in 1961 was because of some very serious blackmail. The rest of his life was spent in a struggle between his artistic freedom and the survival of his family. His works are incredibly powerful, and they are a great representation of his inner turmoil and emotional hardship. He lived a hard life, and I find it magnificent and awe-inspiring that he continued to write beautiful works of art even through his intense censorship. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you learned something interesting about Dmitri Shostakovich. Below is a guided listening list with some of his most famous and well-regarded pieces. Included in those links is a very, very cool video of Shostakovich playing and introducing some aspects of his 7th Symphony. Highly recommend checking that out. Until next week, I will say do svidaniya. Musicology.